So welcome all to the second day of international webinar on pen in the times of pandemics. So in the morning we have Dr. Sunitha Srinivas as the keynote speaker on a very interesting topic of the time. So I officially uh, welcome all you for this session. I welcome Rinu Rijisha to introduce Dr. Sunitha Srinivas for the audience.
Good morning to all. Hope that I am audible. I am so happy to introduce Dr. Sunitha Srinivas, Associate Professor and Principal in charge of Government College, Mokeri, Calicut. She won UGC Research Award in 2016 and has completed her postdoctoral research in film studies with UGC Fellowship. She has several international and national level of articles to her credit. Her works include two collections of poems as well. She is the right person to talk about landscapes of the now, ailing bodies, and an ailing world. I would like to extend a warm and hearty welcome to Dr. Sunitha Srinivas to this international webinar. Please, ma'am.
Thank you. Should I start? Your sound is not that clear here. Am I supposed to start?
Yeah, Dr. Sunitha, you can start. Officially.
Okay. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay.
If your mic can be much nearer, it will be better.
Okay. Yeah, this is the maximum, I think.
It's okay. It's okay. If you are comfortable with that.
Okay. First of all, I'd like to thank the organizers for giving me this session in your seminar. To thank Dr. Abdullah, Rinu, and Sahina, of course, for inviting me and for this wonderful introduction as well. Now, this is really slightly weird talking to a laptop with just 4 or 5 faces before me. Either it's.
But the audience are there in YouTube. So
yeah, I know it's live streaming. I know that, but still, I find it really weird talking to a screen and seeing my face looking back at me. So coming to what I am supposed to talk today about, I've titled it Landscapes of the Now Ailing Bodies and an Ailing World. But first of all, let me tell you, it has got nothing to do with an eco perspective or environment or anything, because there's always the problem of a misleading title of a landscape, either referring to the external world. Of course, it does refer to the external world, but the external space, and they're now indicating the times that we are in. So that would be the way in which I intend moving forward. And since this seminar asks of me to speak of literature, how this particular pandemic context has or will or has contributed to creative writing, uh, I would be actually able only to speak on a very shifting plane, because I've been giving lectures ever since April, and I find that with each session, what we say or what I speak about becomes slightly difficult for me to accept as well, in the sense of time. It keeps changing. At a point you say we have to wait for literature to come out of this times. Now when I stand today, sit in my room and talk to you, today we know that literature and readings have come out of this pandemic space. So naturally what I have spoken about a few months back stands little today. So this sort of problem does exist when you speak within a pandemic context, whenever you speak from within it. But at the same time, one needs to accept that this has actually provided, or this pandemic zone or pandemic times do constitute actually a very fertile terrain terrain for representing or evoking or even problematizing the socio-cultural context in which we live. And each period or each time that you check in literature, you find societies have actually responded to such instances. We have had the plague of Athens, you have had the Black Death. You take any instance of an epidemic, a pandemic, or whether you speak of an outbreak narrative, a contagion narrative, or whatever it is, you find that each society, each time has actually responded to the situation by constructing stories or legends or jokes out of it. And maybe joke would be the reason that we can relate to, would be the way in which trolls function with the corona image that we have actually conceived today, the virus that we have visualized. But a major difference I would place before you would be, we have been reading literature of the pandemic. We've been going through a whole lot of epidemics, but today it is a lived experience that we have. It's not as a reader that we face it today, but it is a lived experience. So that would surely make a difference, because the coming generation would surely go through it as readers. But for us at this point, it is a community affliction, it is a lived experience, and this has actually brought about a tectonic shift in many things, with nations coming to a halt. In many things, I would say, not just issues of mobility, but even with reference to boundaries and a whole lot of things. On the one hand, we speak of mapping the disease. We have a whole lot of route maps being made. We have a whole lot of circulars and edicts being issued, just reminiscent of the plague tracks which once were circulated. And you find how this actually does raise a whole lot of questions. What will be the way in which this pandemic will be represented in the coming days in literature? Of course, keeping in view whatever has been written till date, because you find there is always the way in which we can see it as the past literature and the what will come out of the present times. And when you speak of the past, you need to bring in a whole lot of writings from maybe Thucydides or Boccaccio. You need to come down to Defoe. You have Jack London, you have Camus, you have Shakespeare with his metaphors of disease or illness. You have Ben Jonson, Samuel Pepys. You have a whole lot. Maybe we haven't bothered about it till date, or it has gone unnoticed till now. But when even personally, when I went through it, there are a whole lot of ways in which this has been represented in literature. You find Camus going through it in one way, Boccaccio in another way, and our very favorite Oedipus Rex, the way in which a disease actually affects a whole land. And again, what about Homer? You have Gov't, Langland. You have a whole lot of people who have actually brought in Mary Shelley, Chaucer, Langland, Plowman has actually. Those were the times where there was a tendency to see plague as a punishment for the sins that people committed on earth. So that would constitute what was literature, what was a part of uh, plague narratives or pandemic narratives. When you come down, you will find Simon Armitage recently coming out with Lockdown, his poem. You find people like Duffy, that is Carol Ann Duffy, coming out with online projects where people were asked to post poems. These were attempts actually to come out of the times and also to make creativity possible. You also find very recent, if you want to come very recent times, you find Arundhati Roy coming out with a work Azadi and speaking about the pandemic being a portal. You go on to maybe J.D. Smith with her intimations, where she speaks about the pandemic has placed us at crossroads. Now these are, so naturally it is already on the move. There's no point in talking about or asking ourselves whether any literature will come out of it. Is there a possibility? Or even saying that this is a sort of period of sleep or hibernation. I think at this point, that's why I said at a point, maybe a few months back, this would have been okay when we speak along those lines. But at this point, it's clear that people have, and even even theory, when you go through it, you find people have started theorizing the whole thing. You find Zizek has come out with it, Judith Butler has come out with her views on it. There is Bruno Latour has come out, then Agamben has come out with his views on the pandemic. So a whole lot of things have already come out. So there's no point in thinking about what will happen to literature, what will happen to creativity. It has started. And what about the very recent movie? You know, at least those from Kerala will be able to relate to See You Soon. Which was made very accessible. So creativity is on the move, and actually, it's only to see how this period or the pandemic of COVID, this situation will contribute to it. How things are going to be different from this point of time. So again, we need to think about how it will be represented. But again, as I said, ഈ ഒരു പോയിന്റിൽ നിന്നുകൊണ്ട് അതിനെ കാണുക എന്നുള്ളതല്ലാതെ I wouldn't say how entirely different, because maybe we may end up with the usual illness metaphors or body metaphors, which either are used as critiques or the way in which it's used to externalize an internal illness. So maybe we may take up the usual traditional way in which images are represented along those lines. But I personally feel that it will surely, and the first indication would surely be the way in which a movie like See You Soon was created, the technical side of it. Though, of course, the thematic side, I wouldn't personally consider as anything innovative. But technically, surely, if you go through it, you will very clearly find how the times have influenced its creation. And again, when you speak of Zadie Smith's intimation, that's also another text which you can say it hasn't emerged out of the lockdown, because she speaks a whole lot about times of people she has met before the lockdown. But when you read it, it does include her experience of the lockdown, a whole lot of anxiety that comes out, thoughts that come into her mind, questions that come to her mind regarding time, how relationships would change, what about writing, how it would be placed. And when you read it, the language also, you find the way in which it goes about, you find you get a feeling of maybe what each one of us go through being locked inside. Now, the initial period of lockdown, where we found ourselves cooped up inside the homes, of course, it was nice for us till a certain point doing nothing. But after that, most of us started getting irritated and started looking out for those very rare grocery trips or trips to the shops that we made, the only outings that we had. So on the one hand, you need to see the changes that this particular time, the virus, the pandemic situation has created, how this times will actually make possible artistic expression, or what are the kinds of artistic expression that this pandemic zone will give birth to, whether it will change the way in which we make and appreciate literature. Now, this also needs to be slightly thought about, because maybe at a later point I'll surely try to go through some of the very relevant thematic concerns or aspects that have undergone change when it comes to literature rising out of this particular time, and how these would actually change the way in which we see literature and appreciate literature. Because the first thing would be the shift from the real space to the digital space that has taken place. Because we know the way in which there is more of keeping to yourself and being confined to your own space, which has resulted in even art spaces being reduced to empty spaces. So what you have today are discussions on the virtual space, be it poetry, be it academic discussions or anything. So the space has changed. Along with it, if you note on another plane, the language too has changed. You find a whole lot of medical metaphors have entered it. Military metaphors have entered actually. These are things you will find very clearly when Sontag speaks about in illness as metaphor, where she speaks about how you tend to speak of invasions, you tend to speak of control and surveillance entering into your life. These are things which we go through. So it is entirely different today. That's why I said it's a lived experience. And even when you speak about virus and the viral things, on a digital space, it would work on another plane. So on the one hand, there is a whole lot of mobility, just like the mobility of the virus, which cannot be contained by anything. It keeps moving. But on the other hand, the reality is most of us are confined with less of freedom and less of mobility. And you see how this sense of mobility, which is very central to art, has actually been affected at this point. You think of, as readers, as viewers, if we think of the very basic context, a basic theater. And I'm not speaking about just film. I'm speaking also about plays or drama theater, which actually works on this lived experience. So that has entirely changed. So there was a point. That's why I said what I spoke about, what I thought about a few months back doesn't stand now. Because at this point, many of these theaters have overcome many of the hurdles. Of course, I don't mean to say that things are okay. We are able to achieve a one-on-one on the what was before March or what was pre-COVID times, but a whole lot of problems have been overcome. Now there was നാടക പ്രതിസന്ധിയെ കുറിച്ച് ഒരു കാലഘട്ടത്തിൽ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഇതിന്റെ തുടക്കത്തിൽ സംസാരിച്ചിരുന്നു. പക്ഷേ ഇന്ന് you find theatre has attempted rehearsal practices virtually. So that would be one way in which they have attempted to overcome this. But of course, we know how much of interaction is essential there when you speak of theatre. Then again, you find how this context has made available a whole lot of theatres for us. Now, the National Theatre, Shakespeare Theatre, you find we sitting at our space, in our space, we are able to watch something we wouldn't have access to, something that is far off. So that's why I said mobility is very important in this context. Mobility, very central to art, has been affected. And again, when you speak of mobility, it gets connected not just to theatre art, but you also need to think of it with respect to labor. Because there are various art professions where this is not just art but also labor. Many, especially the field of music, you'll understand, it's just a focus on the musician that comes up, but you also have a whole lot of people sitting at the background for whom it is a profession, a vocation. So naturally, in this context, what happens is you don't have live concerts. So what about them? So that's why I said this is something that has an impact demographically, culturally, politically, economically, and you can't just put it in separate compartments or boxes and sit back and say, oh, that is, you place it there, you place it here, because these have an impact on art. These are things we know, but we never went into because we never had to go through such a pandemic context. So you have these artists sitting at home, and that's why something like fundraisers became essential, because many of them were deprived of their livelihood. You still have the musicians sitting at home and singing, but what about these people? And on the other hand, if you check the Western context, you will find they have moved in another way, where you find Rolling Stones, you find Pink Floyd sitting in their homes, even with their band, and doing concerts. So here, it's not just mobility. You just when we start off, we find it's not just disease, but a whole lot of other things. When you speak of disease, you speak of the body metaphor, you tend to speak of mapping the disease, you tend to speak of the medical gaze, you tend to put it within binaries, saying the patient and the doctor, the sick and the healthy. These would be the very familiar planes along which we move. You speak of the individual body and the collective body. These would be the very clear binaries along which we would move. But on the other hand, these are the things which would also matter. That's why I said it's not just a question of body, but even mobility, even time, even space. All these do come into it. And again, coming back to something like mobility, as I said, things become very essential. Things like fundraisers become very essential. Issues of caste come up within it. You find it operating in various contexts. You find how issues of again, when you speak of mobility, how would a theater work? Again, a theater, you speak of a film theater, we go there, it's a social space where you meet, but all this is made impossible today because touch is a problem today. Because you see, it's not just a question of mingling with others. You fear touching your face with your hands. The first thing you do after going out and coming inside is wash your hands, and more important today is a sanitizer. And uh, and I think touch is a way in which we can connect with others. You shake hands with them, you tap the other person's shoulder, and we are at a point where you can't even touch your face, or you can't even wipe your nose without the fear that your hand is properly sanitized. So all these things, they do have an impact, but maybe not in a very direct manner, but it does. So on a plain surveillance, or this sort of control, or this imposition of control is occurring at different planes. അതിന് വളരെ വ്യക്തമായിട്ട് കാണണമെങ്കിൽ നമ്മൾക്ക് ഒരു ഒരു ഡിസ്ട്രിക്ട് ലെവലിൽ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ സെൻട്രൽ ലെവലിൽ സർക്കാരിന്റെ ലെവലിൽ ഇറക്കുന്ന ഉത്തരവുകളായിട്ട് കാണാം. This is a containment zone, or this is not a containment zone for this and this period of time you are under lockdown. So those may be one way in which you can see surveillance being imposed on you. Just like that's why I spoke about the plague tracks. ഒരുപാട് വർഷങ്ങൾ മുമ്പ് plague tracks വളരെയധികം significance ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. കാരണം they were actually advice warnings. You can see again, when I speak of time, when I speak of literature, now I do use all this in a very loose manner, because it's not just the literature that as literature students we approach, because medical narratives also, journalistic narratives also, you can see as literature, all these tracks which come out of the government imposing restrictions on us would also be another way in which the pandemic would be recorded in future. And naturally, when again ഇതിന്റെ അകത്തൊക്കെ ഓരോന്ന് എടുത്തിട്ടുണ്ടെങ്കിലും, do you have people from other states?
Yeah, I was just to mention you that people from outside also.
Sorry. No, this is another problem. You don't get to see anybody. You don't get to. So again, the problem is, as I said, all these. I use time. I use when I speak. I speak of literature in a very loose sense, because all these would also contribute towards what would be narratives coming out of this pandemic times. And again, when we speak of time, the question of contemporaneous. But when you speak of contemporaneous, it is again not just a singular relationship with one's own time. You also need to see it as a relative one, and again you need to see how the contemporary moment is also geographically bounded. That is why I spoke about time and space being important within this context. And in this situation, I would again speak of something what Agamben has put forward. Now he speaks of how contemporaneity also is our times being yoked with another time, or rather many other times, and the relationship between them signifies their contemporary nature. So again, somewhat maybe the easiest way would be the presentness of the past and the pastness of the present. That would be the very, very basic way in which you can see it. So even today, when you speak of pandemic times and pandemic literature out of the plague times, you go back to Boccaccio, and you start down and come. So naturally, that's why I said maybe the coming generations, though they don't have a lived experience, they would surely go back, or they would surely be referring to our literature as well as a literature which came out of a pandemic times. So on the one hand, you would find within these literature subjective time, and as well as a historical or clock time. So time and the space would be important. We'll go into that later. I was speaking about these plague tracks, or these how surveillance or control or power would operates within this. So these plague tracks, they are something that you will find even in when you go through past plague literature, how these narratives actually generate knowledge about these diseases. Now they shape, or they help in shaping responses about the disease. Now they actually function in different ways, these sorts of narratives. They give you knowledge about what the actual situation. Now the nearest we can relate to is all of us go and sit before the television by 4:35 to know how many COVID patients are there. these are the ways in which we track, or you check your FB, you check the collector's page, you check all these relevant pages to see how many patients, how many uh, are negative. All these things would again work within the same context. So these would shape responses to the pandemics, the precautions that are to be taken, and all these do have material consequences for the people within the boundaries. So within, it can be within this district, it can be within a nation, depending on the source that issues the tract or the circular or edict or whatever it is. So in a way, it is also, or you can say, it also gives the reader a control over the events, or an understanding. This is how things are today. And if you go through it, you will also find how these tracts, they do have a particular way in which the narrative moves. So the span of the pandemic becomes important, and that's where the all sorts of surveillance becomes important. And when you speak of span of the pandemic epidemic difference is also made, depends on this span, the space within which it occurs. So naturally, now things are no longer regional, local, or limited. It works on a larger span. So it needs to move out of the body, even though it emerges from the body. And it does raise a whole lot of questions when it comes to literature, how the times would get depicted. Because as I said, how will literary studies take this up? Now, where these questions have been, answers are on the move, we can say. Not these don't exist as questions today, but again, when you approach these things, you need to think about issues of mobility, issues of touch, because that touch would be the elementary interaction with not just others, but even with our own body. So you have a rigorous system of power and organization, which actually controls things, not just the virus, which also puts you in control. And because of this power operation, you find how many unequal spaces are also created. I think this would become very clear when you think about the migration issue and the migratory spaces that were created. And that is why mobility, I spoke about mobility, because boundaries, I again did speak about the boundaries becoming porous, because for us, the national boundary would be important. But what about people crossing borders? So we know the restrictions that were imposed on them, the whole lot of issues that it created. So on the one hand, you find these sorts of narratives. You go through these, whether it be outbreak narratives or pandemic narratives or whatever contagion narratives you have, you find this borderless tendency of the virus, and you find how these narratives articulate community on a national scale, and as it identifies the health and well-being of those legally within the border of the state with its worthy representatives. So you have restrictions being placed on people entering your space, because that's your space. But at the same time, you have a virus which moves at a very hectic speed. So these that's why I said mobility also becomes important, not just when you speak of art. Art would again place a whole lot of problems when you speak of mobility. Again, that's why even when you speak of the mobility of labor, again, the economic space comes up. A whole lot of people without jobs coming in, and how that would actually affect the economy. Naturally, all these things would be related, and would contribute to whatever literature is going to come up. So you have a public space today where which is filled with anxiety, with a whole lot of fear, and a whole lot of people who see physical proximity as a danger. But at the same time, I would say it would be possible to see, when you analyze disease narratives, that these narratives do not spring up with new outbreaks or diseases, but are in continuous circulations and are recycled opportunistically. That is, it's not something where epidemic literature or pandemic literature is not something that suddenly came up with the coronavirus. You have it whenever you have had epidemics, and naturally you need to see it as a kind. That's why I spoke about time, contemporaneity, and all these things. So you have, on the one hand, this germ incubating human body, and the other side you have the creative writer and the creative thought incubating body, or where the body becomes a space of productive gestation, and literary narratives actually reflect the ways a past moment reverberates into the present in the ineffable conversation between the body's experience and our perception of the world. When you have a literature out of a particular time, it's not just individuals' literature or creative piece coming out, it's also a time and a perception of the world that is placed before you. So what would be the thematic concerns as such that you would have in the present time? That would also be significant. Would it actually be something that we are familiar with? Would it actually stick to the health or illness motives that we are familiar with, the medical metaphors that our literature has been filled with? Or would it confine to the binaries that again we are familiar with, the patient doctor, the healthy ill body that we are again familiar in literature with? Another question that would come up with, what would be the mode of expression? Would it just be the descriptive analysis that or the clinical description that we would be going in for observers? These would also exist within the narratives that come out of these times. This would be common to many ages, because you may have the observer perspective, you may have the sufferer perspective, you may have the doctor perspective, you may have a teller or the speaker narrating something. It can be a personal narrative, an autobiographical or a lived narrative note, an interpretative account you may have, or even, that's why I said journalistic accounts may also. But when you speak of a journalistic account, there is a slight problem with accountability as well, because within journalistic accounts, you need to bring in a whole lot of statements of officials, either government or medical, and those narratives would actually come within issues of transparency. How far are these statistics that we get true? That would be one question. Such things do matter when you speak of journalistic narratives or narratives like this. And maybe when you speak of such narratives, we can also think about things like counter narratives that may emerge out of this context. And one example would be naturally these circulars which come out, which are created by the medical department or the administrative wings of governments or district or collectorate or whatever it is, which actually are also attempts at alleviating the fear of the people. You can say removing the rumors of people. So a sort of counter narrative is also created there, the different ways in which narratives may work inside this. So on the one hand, you may have a counter narrative. On the other, as I was speaking about mobility, you may even have global narratives being made possible, because what you find here is, on the one hand, we do speak of boundaries, but on the other, you find that while global networks have changed the way we understand time and space, the global boundaries were rendered fully porous by the pandemic, as I was saying. So naturally, on the one hand, global networking was made possible by the digital space. You have the global functioning of the virus, and on the other hand, you also have the way in which restrictions were imposed on. So how would the narrative act of telling and being heard be influenced by this? I think the best example would be the movie See You Soon, the way in which the different spaces have been linked to it. We know the characters functioning from different spaces there. And again, in literature also, as I said, I was speaking about all these works that come out of this times, be it Simon Armitage or be it the other works that I have been referring about, or any of you needn't have all these famous or renowned writers, but even the lesser known poets and other writers coming out of the times, you find this anxiety of what next. You do have eyewitness accounts, you do have analysis of the pandemic times coming at different points, and what you find is the fear and the anxiety coming out of these recounting, which presents before you the real time as well as the possibility of a fictitious time within it. And if we speak within an Indian context, I think people who are familiar with UR Anandamurthy's Samskara would be a very clear example of how a plague would work within a text. The way in which he speaks, it actually becomes a critique of what he describes within the text. Again, as I was speaking of this global networking, we need to think also about a networked novel, a pandemic narrative, where this narrative would reflect a networked narrative, in the sense a writing which would knit together disparate sets of temporal and frequently disjunct space. That's why I repeatedly kept talking about time and space, where you have disparate temporality and disjunct space, locations that are interconnected at the level of narrative structures as well as thematically interlaced. These would also be possible, because we need to think about this global networking and the networked narrative structure of a novel, because that would surely reflect the 21st century networked life that we have. When you speak of 21st century networked life, I would surely mean the sort of networked existence that has been made possible by globalization, the hectic pace at which the internet has invaded our life. It can even be the pace at which migrations have taken place. All these things would actually be relevant there. And we can even have the sort of very descriptive, terrifying narratives like we had of pandemics in art at different points of time, where the body gets ugly, or physical, social desolation. But this physical ugliness wouldn't be possible in the present context, because we have something like a coronavirus, where what is put under threat is your breath. So naturally, one possibility, or one area that I personally think would require analysis is how, because I hope most of us would be familiar, because most of us would have checked the net and the Wikipedia regarding coronavirus, and we would be very familiar with how the first and the most severe indication, usually what goes with it, is a respiratory distress, or the asphyxiated state that goes along with it when you take the medical side of it. And of course, apart from that, we would also have this suffocative state that we find being locked down. So I think this situation may also contribute towards studies in breathing or breath studies. We have had studies in from this angle. If you are familiar with French literature, you do have studies that have taken up such analysis of breath narratives, because we know that it is the first, or it has got autonomic function. It's the first thing that we do on our own. It is very essential to our life, and that is something that is at stake today. And on the other hand, when I say this, I'm also very aware this coronavirus also puts us in a very shifting plane. That's why I said this moment or this time is really very shifty as well. You don't know. Today you may be in a containment zone. Tomorrow it's declared that things are okay. You may go out. Today suddenly curfew is declared. Tomorrow you have people telling you that things are okay. It is the next ward that is in trouble, so they are put under containment. You shouldn't go there. Again, you have shifting boundaries. You have a whole lot of such shifting things, and I was speaking about breath and how significant it is, and how essential to life it is. But on the other hand, when we speak of this virus, even when I speak of the medical side of it, I was also thinking about what very clearly Sundar Sarukai has brought out this aspect of it, this virus. These are things that he actually says about the virus. So when that aspect is taken, an analysis of breath narratives, I don't know how far this would come up, but I think such studies may become possible for those who are interested in the area. because one finds that this is what the Sarokai says, not all who are exposed to the virus fall ill. So you find that the way in which this virus actually puts you in trouble. Even for those who have the virus, it does not affect them all in the same way. We know the way in which things are moving today. Maybe I am a carrier. I may not show any of the indications. I may just pass it on to somebody else and go my own way. And the other person may be the person who suffers. And the way in which I react to this virus needn't be the way in which somebody else does that. So this is what he says: variance in responses of different bodies to the same virus, the different responses of the individual to their surroundings, the physical, and what he's trying to say is now this shifting, all these shifting, the change in the present socio-economic, political, cultural context due to this single virus, which is very shifting. You find the individual combating the disease. You find how the physical and sensory alienation from the fellow beings in society. Now, this physical sensory alienation that I'm speaking about, I do refer to the alienation or separation that we have had in different spaces. You just think about the canteen spaces in our colleges that we don't have today, inside the theaters, inside a stadium, inside a museum, a theater, either the stage or the, of course, in the times to come, it will change. I know that. Still, the alienation that we are going through, or this sort of distancing that we are going through at this point, will also alienate the artist from the culture and the art from the viewer and the listener. And that is why I spoke about the mobility at the initial. I spoke about time and space. So what it actually does is, it to a large extent destroys, even when you speak about the global networking, or however vociferous I become about the whole lot of interconnectedness that we have today. And one thing that this has actually done is it has actually destroyed the community experience of art that actually has happened. And even when I speak about interdependence, or the way in which interconnectedness. Now, when I speak of global reach or global networking or interdependence, all these things do come within this pandemic context, the way in which we are connected. You also find each individual has been socially distanced from the other. So I think this context would also serve as a critique to the individual note that we have been speaking about. So coming back to breath, or breathing, that I was speaking about. Now, you do have such analysis, keeping in mind French writing, especially 19th, 20th century writers like Proust, Paul Valéry, Laforgue, all those are Celan. You have André Gide. Those of you are familiar with Immoralist, maybe you may have an idea of what I'm speaking about. Either on a personal plane, some of these writers suffered from asthma, some of them suffered from TB. We are familiar with the way in which Thomas Mann speaks about TB in Magic Mountain, or the way in which he brings up cholera in Death in Venice. All those, the way. So the way in which you go about would be entirely different, but breath has more or less, or you can see it as more or less a metonym for life itself. You can see it as a sensation. You can see it in the way in which pauses are made, in which rhythm, pattern, all these things move within literature. And maybe if you're familiar, we also have, I think it is Irigaray, yeah. Irigaray, who was, I don't exactly remember. It's The Age of Breath, where she actually uses breath to, in a, she uses breath in a theoretical manner to, you can say, to break stereotypes of sexes. So the way in which breath actually works inside. And maybe we would be familiar with Allen Ginsberg, Kerouac, all of them, the vitalism that we associate with their writings, and the way in which their poems move. And there's also the way in which we draw a parallel between, especially in Kerouac, the parallel between breath measure and the jazz, the way in which all those things move. So it would be interesting, if possible, at least this is something that came to my mind just because of the way in which corona works on the body today. So there are possibilities to analyze how breath inscribes itself within literature. And maybe when you see performance, I think breath would again be significant there on a stage performance. You just think about a character like Hamlet, the whole lot of sighing and emotional note that you find this character presenting before us. So that would also be important. And again, well, if you're familiar with Merleau-Ponty, he has again spoken about this interdependent quality of the breath, where when he says, you breathe in what I breathe out. So again, that would be another plane on which this works. And that is at stake today, because I fear the air around and the way in which the virus travels. So that's a reason why I actually uh, uh, passingly thought of referring to breadth, and how this would also be important within it. And there were also other two things that I was wondering about. One is whether we would have travel narratives during these times. I don't mean what travel signifies within immigrant context, or mobility, immigration, what all those things that would I would personally place within sociology. I don't mean that, but otherwise also we do have yatra vivaranangal, where we have had, those are familiar with the local literature, we do will understand this. So whether how far, what is it going to be, because we have virtual tours today, virtual tour of museums and all those things. So naturally, how would the travel writing reflect this? How would it be chronicled within this containment zone? And when the such travel, when such mobility is actually thought about, one figure which most of us are familiar with. We always talk about the flaneur, the person who's Baudelaire, whose element is the crowd, who goes about moving with the crowd, who's very, who feels at ease with the crowd. That is the element, his element or his domain, whose passion is to merge with the crowd. How would we see such a figure within the narrative today? Because you don't have something like a crowd now. Of course, you do associate it with the urbanity that Walter Benjamin has also spoken about at a later stage. But just on a surface level, when you have a figure like that, how would that figure be placed in the present context, where you have more of barriers being established, either through the masks or the protected PP kits that you have, or the quarantine regulations, or border policies, or even travel restrictions that are placed before you? Because all these barriers that are restricted and placed before you, they also reflect your fear, the anxiety, the vulnerability, and also the frailty of geographic corporeal borders that also needs to be thought about in this context, because these would be the context from which literature would or narratives would draw at different points of this. And even when you go through earlier traditional literature, there have been attempts to track formulaic patterns within it, and that would be very easy as well. In the narrative in Dagatha, that is the narrative, and how this narrative works in a formulaic pattern. That would be very easy to track, where you see a beginning, a crisis, and an end. End is just a supposed end in this context, because you don't know what this end is. We speak about post-COVID, again marking time, post, pre, again time. and we don't know what this end is. We do speak of a future time, but we don't know how this end is going to be marked. We don't know whether it's the last patient that is going to leave the hospital that's going to mark this end. We don't know how this end actually is going to work for us. It can be anything. It can be is it the schools going back to normal, us going back to the college, or is it the economy reviving? Is it a return to work that is going to mark this end? So we don't know. And even when we speak of end, this is going to be placed within different times in different places also, I would think, because what is in China is different in New York and it's different in India. So naturally, the end is also going to be, however much of global networking we speak, it's going to be reflected in different ways, in different spaces and different times. So there's going to be a whole lot of replication and repetition of what we have had in the disease narrative so far. And as I was speaking about this formulaic pattern, the basic thing would be the usual, where the disease starts at a particular moment in time, where it is limited to us what we can identify as the present the contemporary pandemic situation, a period of it being contained, or attempts at containing it by limiting it to space and duration, and how there is a whole lot of tension building up, how it affects the individual and the collective body, and again how it drips towards a closure. Now that's why I very simplified it as a beginning crisis and as a post end, when you keep the present times in mind. So maybe when you have a repetition, as I was speaking, a repetition of particular images, metaphors, or storylines even, we may have descriptions, we may have memoirs, we may have diaries coming, lockdown diaries, lockdown poems, lockdown thoughts coming out as books. We have already had all those things. And we also need to be very aware and open of that would be the landscape now, because all these things come into writing even when we speak of creativity, because publishing has also changed. So we need to think about that as well. So you may have a whole lot of things. On the one hand, you still have digital consumption of all these things. So naturally, many works will be written from different perspectives, but repetition of particular characters, images, storylines has produced or will produce and shape new paradigms of diseases and fear. Now, the way in which, that's why I said real time and fictive time, how it would be, it would go through the thought process, the conscious time, the subjective time, and the clock time, how it would be fictively presented. All this would work within it, how the world would be perceived, how the present times would be perceived. And the stories we tell also, in a way, will circumscribe our thinking about global health, human interactions as the world imagines or refuses to imagine the next pandemic. That would also be significant. I think there's also the possibility of this dying down, supposed end, and there is also the danger of this coming up again. So that's, since we are in it, the hotspot or the epicenter or the focal point of it, we will surely think about, since every year now we think about the flood next year. So maybe there is every possibility of us thinking of something like this happening again. So the response, and maybe we need to also think about how it would be, the reader would also be significant. Now, when you speak of creative writing, the reader would also be important. How this narrative will reach us is not just an important thing, because when you speak of how this narrative will be created, we are thinking about the telling, the listening, the witness, the memoir, or the memory being significant, because you tend to recount as a doctor, as a patient. It becomes a narrative that will recount things. The reader would also be important, because when we read it, we will relate to it, because it's also a lived experience. We are in the same time span, but after many years, the time would be different. So the reader would be in a particular point of time, the narrative would be in another point of time, would be written in another point of time. You may even have the characters shifting through different points of time. So the pandemic field produces particular narratives which range from outbreak narratives emphasizing threat to global population to marginalized narratives. I don't, that is, sorry, that is why I've been speaking about global networks as well as marginal networks, global narratives as well as marginal narratives. We need to think about marginal narratives as well in these times. Migrant narratives, what will happen to it, what will be the autobiographical, how will memory play a significant role inside this, or how will I was also speaking about travel. Now travel would also bring in why this question whether we will have travel narratives at this point, because what we are in today is a point of waiting, and the problem is the society is waiting for this to end, and it's only when this end becomes possible that more flexibility, freedom of mobility. Today we do move, of course, but there is a fear, but that wouldn't be travel in the sense of what we used to enjoy earlier. So this involves a certain amount of waiting, and when you speak of waiting, especially from the context of a migrant, it is not just a situational waiting. It would also be in the sense of an existentialist waiting in the sense of situational. I would mean waiting for the rules to come out. I mean the border policies to come out, whether travel rules or travel decisions to come out for you to say whether you need to get a permission from the RT to travel across the district or across the border, or how this is possible. On the other hand, the existentialist note, because you have an uncertain future, and when this wait will end is also another thing. And with reference to the migrant, this is a problem, because you have this migrant. For the migrant, the connectivity is made possible only through the mobile and the app, which again destroys or displaces notions of time and space, because he communicates with his family through this digital space, moving from one end to the other. So as I was saying, you will surely have the mapping of disease during this time. We will surely have the different ways in which mobility would enter. It wouldn't be just a thematic concern. It may appear in the narrative in one way or the other. It may appear in the networking that occurs when you, since many of you are familiar with See You Soon, to make it clear, I would just say how all these characters are placed within different spaces. You find them interacting and the story is formed. And at the same time, you see how the screen is a space where the whole thing moves. And for us also, it's not the theater, which is a space where the movie is shared with the other so-called social space, but what happens is we sit individually and we are seeing it on our mobile phones, and that is again the space in which it was released is another thing. And if you're familiar with the background work of the movie, you find various interviews where the director has told us that all these people were accommodated in different apartments. A whole apartment was taken up and all those things. And that's why I said space and time become a problem, because you have an apartment and each apartment becomes a different time zone. And if you are in a containment, the building itself comes within a different time zone. And again, within a home space, that's why I said space and time become a problem and will offer a whole lot of possibilities to us, because this lockdown space has to a great extent affected our experience. Now today we don't have the 11 o'clock break where we go to the canteen and sit and have tea. And you sit at home and slog the whole day. Of course, we do have our online classes, but that is the only thing. Maybe that is also to a certain extent adjustable. If you miss out on it, you can always take it in the evening. So there is a certain amount of flexibility, and you lose your sense of date, you lose your sense of time, which day it is. But there was a routine. The bell used to ring. You used to rush to the class. When it was 11, something told you that you need to go to the canteen and you need to meet there. That's also a social space. Evening after your lunch, 3 o'clock, again the canteen where you meet everybody. All that doesn't occur today. And you have a home space. We have reduced to the domestic space, where the domestic space or that space become multiple spaces. So that's why I said time and space becomes multiple. Just like that's why I keep repeating all these terms: mobility, space, time, all these things. You have a single space of the home where you have multiple spaces. You have the domestic space where you find the woman working. You find the school space there where the children are attending online classes. You have the again the workspace where you find the same woman or the man going and sitting and working. So there are different spaces there. And again, the spaces may also afford different time zones, because when you have a workspace, you can even communicate with somebody in some other place, some other, apart from the time zone can also be different. So the way in which we experience time and space as differed, become different, or the way we relate to time during the crisis has become different. So more or less you have what would be a pandemic time, which has changed our perception of space, of mobility, of almost everything. And what I would personally call would be a sort of enforced presentism. What I would mean by enforced presence, this is a term right out of anthropology, where it just means a feeling of being stuck in the present, combined with the inability to plan ahead. You don't know what the end is, what is going to happen. So the present time is based on what I would call an imagined future. An imagined future, which you don't know when this is going to end, and that future is possible. You don't know when you're going back to work, when that schedule is going to come back. So these sorts of words, enforced presentism, or another term that I liked, especially with this lockdown period, is tricking time. Tricking time I use because, again, this time, it's not something that's constant, because you find it speeding up, accelerating and decelerating. You find it speeding up, slowing down. You find it being restructured. That's why I said sometimes you're in the containment zone, you're stuck at home. Sometimes you're given the freedom to move out, and all those ways in which time has actually shifted. Because earlier we are very familiar with the time of subjectivity or consciousness and the spatialized time of the clock ticking. What we would be familiar in Joyce or Woolf, Dorothy Richardson, all those writers. But on the other hand, we also have narratives working with complex and contradictory time frames, how they have actually experimented with non-linear narrative forms. So what I would relate to people like Cortázar or Julio Cortázar or Thomas Pynchon, all those writings, the way in which time is just a sort of snip snap mode that you find there. You also find the way in which the present gets. Should I stop? Am I running?
If you don't mind,
Shall I
please
stop there?
point up. We can move to the discussion point.
Okay, I just wanted to speak about this pandemic zone or time, actually, which has brought about a dismantling of space and a whole lot of things that come into it, because the lockdown time is different. You have the quarantine time is different. So a whole lot of things coming up where the attempt is actually to bring down the rate of social coalition. So I think I'll just wind up with that, since we are running out of time. So I would wind up by saying that maybe it must end, or this pandemic time must end, and just as it has begun. But of course, the process of getting ourselves out of this time is not going to be that easy, or this zone or time zone is not going to be that easy, because we are a little more involved than getting into it was. And maybe every part of the world will emerge out of this context in one way or the other, and literature will surely reflect it in one way or the other. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, ma'am, for the nice presentation on the topic and very inclusive of all the aspects, not only the literature, but the theater and the lived experiences of the people around the world who are in a kind of uh, contained to the time and space and personal experiences, or we can say domesticated experiences rather than the social experience they were part of in the time before. So now the time is for interaction. So like the Sahina Miss and Muhammad sir and other people to have some interactions, and we will take some questions from the YouTube viewers, and we will share with you, and you can answer it, and then we will move to the felicitation and all things. Okay, Miss Sahina.
Yes, yes. Yes, can you hear me? Yes, is it
It's not
audible?
that clear. I mean, your sound is not that clear here, but speak.
Yeah,
I'll
it's
try my best
audible.
to
You
get
can
it
louder.
a little louder, if possible.
Okay, ma'am. Okay, okay.
I'm just trying to reach, get your sound.
All things are shifting. Actually, writings and narratives and lifestyle and even our thinking. I think all the things had been shifting from. That means we are changing day to day level of thoughts, and we are not at all in a single sphere. So, what do you think about that?
I think that is what I have been trying to mention when I spoke about the time as such. And maybe one thing I left out was speaking since that shifting note was taken up. That would be something that the single word pandemic is a portal that Arundhati Roy speaks about, or the networking that Zadie Smith speaks about. So naturally, this would needs to be seen as a liminal space or a liminality, or the pandemic time that we have before us would surely place before us new patterns of connectivity. uh, we are familiar that the 9 to 5 or 9 to 4 schedule has changed. So new connectivity, new time patterns are set before us. So this would be, we need to see it more or less as a liminal stage, which will surely take some time to pass. It will keep more changing. It will go slow, it will increase in speed.
I'm mentioning that it's, in past literature we can see the same type of thoughts are going, but nowadays we are shifting from one to another, and that is maybe about our containment of or our about our thoughts are shifting, because isn't it?
That's why I was saying maybe that when it comes to images, we may go back to the same way of using images, the very familiar way in which if you want to show a villain, you just show visualize him as a diseased body. Or you just want to convey that a group of people have committed sin, you just give a pestilence to them. I mean, you just add a pestilence or a plague to the storyline. That would be one traditional way, but I'm sure since we have been seeing the change. I think Rajastri's novel would be one instance of where we have already had change. A novel which was released on the digital platform being published. So this is already change has already been initiated, keeping in mind the digital space that we have moved into. The pandemic has actually accelerated it because that's the only space where we can get ourselves heard, because publishing houses have been shut down. Now they are slowly reviving. You see the way in which publishing houses were shut down. If you're familiar, whenever you talk to them, they tell you that we can't bring out books, and even people have gone on to e-publishing. So you see that's another change that the digital space has brought about. And if you're familiar with it, you can publish and unpublish a book. I publish a book, and I can make editions each and every. I can edit it each and every moment. Of course, it may have its restrictions. I think Kindle offers it. I think there's some app. I don't actually remember it now. These are things that I
Readers,
went through
Yes,
this.
Kindle,
Kindle.
And
Amazon,
sorry, Amazon. Sorry, Amazon.
Amazon Kindle.
Yeah, Amazon Kindle. Yeah, right.
Even
And you can,
even
I think, even publish and unpublish them. All those things. It's just a click. So things have changed. So naturally, this is. It's,
but but another thing is that when we see about this type of changes, normally people are going to nostalgic thoughts, because they always want that the thing which had happened at the previous days. They want to bring back that thing. So okay, so when we say about that shift, automatically we want to bring back the thing which we have missed in our life, isn't it? I maybe
it's not a question of bringing back something we have not experienced, because nobody would want to bring back a plague into our life, right? So
not
it's
about
not
the
a question,
play.
but experiencing what
Yes,
the other person. Now, that's why I said, as a reader, it would be different. When I read Camus' play, we know that it stands for something else. He's indicating also something else. You think about Defoe. Defoe is describing something that has happened many years back. So it's also a way in which narrative has incorporated a pestilence into literature. So this would be different for me when I write now. It's a lived experience, but I also, when at this point I write, I also use my memory.
yeah,
When I'm out of this pandemic zone or pandemic time, I will use my memory. So naturally, memory would be important there. It would
yeah,
work in different manner, different ways. So again, that would be memory I'm writing into my lived experience. But again, it can be purely also a memoir from or an autobiographical writing, or a diary from a doctor who has gone through the lived experience. It can operate at different levels. It
yeah,
can be the memoir of a migrant. It can be the memoir of a woman. Gender is also important here. The way in which this has worked for a woman is entirely different.
yes, yes,
So all these things would, I think, it exists in an intertwined manner. It doesn't mean it has to be there. It doesn't mean that you will go to it in the same way. It would work in different ways as a writer, as a reader. Even when I read it, when I read what I write at this point, read it at a later point, this would mean something else to me then.
So I would like Mohammed
thank you,
sir
ma'am.
will have some interaction regarding.
Thank you, madam. I am so much
Sure.
excited by your presentation. I
Thank you.
think that if some writers may happen to watch your presentation, they may get some hints to write down.
Thank you. Thank
When you speak about lived experiences, uh, you said about you skipped on caste system.
you. Yeah.
Then I thought that caste system that exists in our body itself. Our hands are untouched, faces are untouched, like
Yeah,
that.
that was what I actually skipped a whole lot of things. Now, since so you brought it up, now caste, I was actually also referring to music specifically. Now, I don't know how far people are familiar. Now, that the music as an art form works in a very caste-based manner. So that
Yeah.
was why I was also referring to the labor force that was working behind the musician. Now, on the other hand, since caste has been brought up, what about race? On the one hand, I spoke about breathing breath, and we had the visuals of George Floyd being suffocated
Yeah.
to death, the race that was working there. So naturally, this was the same period that has brought again touch, as you said. All
So
these.
what I okay. So what I have to say, ask is, our narrative technique may change in this space, uh, and how you define this narrative. Now we are sitting in different spaces, and maybe in a meta narrative technique, in different spaces, may character develop. I
Okay.
think that they cannot meet They
Okay.
cannot meet.
a
Lovers
virtual
cannot meet
virtual space
in a
of
space.
characters.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay. So how would I speak of this narrative? That I think what
Narrative
would be
technique that
the
may come after.
okay. Now, speaking of, as such, when you speak of illness narratives, you tend to speak of outbreak narratives, contagion narratives, uh, narratives of illness, epidemic narratives. These would be the way. But personally, at this point, I would like to personally use the word of networked narrative, I would say, because a whole lot of
Yeah.
things have been going into this. A whole lot. I don't know how far this is going to work out. I mean, how far all these things are going to come into writing. But this is how I would perceive something at this point. It may change, as I said. I mean, what I spoke about, many of those things don't stand today. At a point in April when I was talking, I was speaking about will literature come out of this? Now, today, I can't speak like that. I mean, a whole lot of literature has already come out of this. We have actually adapted to the existing globally networked context. We have gone ahead. Even you must have heard the Binale is going to be held virtually, and there are discussions of conducting the Binale on a virtual space. You have the Western museums being opened out where you can have a virtual visit of these spaces. A whole lot of things are happening everywhere. Now, outside, you also have the West. If you're familiar, we also find how art has been modified. Actually, there are restaurants have been reopened, and one way in which I think the term uses plexiglass glass being used to separate one person from the other. You have a shield before you. Today we see police, the cops, using the shield. Apart from the mask, you have a plastic shield before them. But I think that was drawn from this art context where you, if you're familiar with Facebook and Insta and all that, you find how this is posted there as well. The COVID museum, which actually reflects the art that has come out of the COVID times. Now, again, you have people working within this field, especially architecture, where you find restaurants have been closed down, which has naturally affected the finance and the business. And they did come very early, even in I think April. By April end, I think they had restaurants having these plexiglass. They have a plastic sheet before them. So I sit here, the other person sits there with this sheet. Naturally, there would be no contact. You would just be seeing each other. You would have your food before you. The other person would have his or her food with them. So that also would be another way in which art has been conceived. Now, we didn't think of creativity and art just as what goes in writing. There are other painting, all those.
Ma'am, we have questions from the audience. Rama Neelamegam asking about how far memory aids to archive things related to the past. How far our memory aids to archive things related to the past. A question from an audience.
This is the present, and it's only, of course, from this point, I can speak about uh, what has already, many of the things I think, of course, has already been pushed to the past. But memory would surely be relevant at this point, and that would be the place where what I spoke of as journalistic writings would all be very relevant because uh, that is the way in which this pandemic is going to be recorded through literature, through all those diaries, through all those things, which are all those narratives that are going to come out, be it medical narratives, that will surely be a part of memory writing at a later point. It's only to be seen. And memory would surely work in different various other ways as also within this. When as I think I did speak about that earlier when one of the faculty asked of how you would uh, think about this lived experience at a later point when you would relate it to the next generation and it would again be passed on from one generation to another, how that actually becomes a part of what was once a lived experience. That's why I said the reader is also important. The reader who reads at this point, of course, will relate to it, but the reader who reads at a later point, just like we read many of these earlier pandemic writings, for us, it's just a story from which we understand history. That is also archiving that has taken place. We understand the times, but again, the question of reliability also comes in there when you have a blurring of the real and the fictive there. When you have a creative writing coming up, you find that the painting also poses such issues. If you are familiar with the whole lot of painting that is associated with um, plague, you may understand this. We also have a whole lot of writers who have died either because of um, being a part of Black Death. Some of them lost their parents. Now, all these experiences have actually gone into writing. All these are also archiving of what has happened at a particular point. So, what as the whoever it is has asked, memory would lived experience, memory, and archiving of this in different forms would take place as time moves on. That would be significant. Yes.
Okay, I think we are running out of time, and we just have some closing remarks regarding your presentation. I think your all thesis would be put in short that our lived experiences are in quarantine. I think this pandemic have made us physically and socially in quarantine, and our experiences, not only for the literature, but for the artists, the laborers, the migrants, and all the experiences are in a kind of quarantine. They cannot experience the life they were in past. So the pandemic, the post-pandemic shift, maybe maybe bring some anxiety about the next, and the field of any, as Muhammad Sir mentioned, we are thinking about the physical untouchability. Self cannot touch self, and so the physical distancing become a social normal, and the social distancing of the cultural or caste inequalities have become a new normal. So the time will bring the shift of time, as you mentioned, the actual time and our the clock ticking time will make new meanings. So the whole shift of mental, social, personal, individual space, time will be a new experience. Maybe our past experience of social living may be constrained to a individual spaces. So we expect the pandemic bring more experience, virtual experiences than lived experiences. Maybe a new opening for us. So we will be in a good will of the pandemic, rather than being panic of the pandemic. So very thankful for a live presentation on the time, space, and the constraints that the pandemic have brought into the field of patient, how the doctor, how the power is used by the government, how we are contained to zones and shifted to another space, time. So the social and power shifting, political, and every aspect of the pandemic have, I think, touched. So very thankful for being with us for this kind of presentation. I would like invite Jaseela PT, Head of Department of Commerce, have felicitation for this event. Jaseela Pity, kindly.
Okay, is it audible?
Yeah.
Okay.
Can you
Most
on your video?
okay.
Okay.
Okay. Most respected principal, Dr. Anush Shafi sir, respected Mohammed sir, today's guest, Sunitha Srinivasan, HOD Shahina Miss, my colleagues, Abdullah sir and Rinu Rijisha, and other colleagues from colleges, and my students and participants from various colleges. It is indeed a very pleasure for us that the Department of English has conducting such kind of a webinar, international webinar regarding the present scenario. I deeply have a notice on the yesterday session and today's session. I can understand that when we have a look on the history, we can see that a lot of revolutionary changes have been taken place as a result of this kind of pandemic, sorry, this kind of situations, this kind of risky situations. Even though in economic, cultural, social, any kind of revolutionary changes in this scenario, in this pandemic situation too, I think as Hashimi said in the last session, silence and sound has a great interconnection. And also today's session, Sunitha ma'am said that the thoughts and the imaginaries of the persons are in incubation. So automatically there will be a introduction of this kind of literary works will be coming after the panic days, and I expect that a lot of valuable works have been created in this quarantine period. Anyway, I would like to congratulate all the team members of Department of English for conducting this kind of a webinar, and also I felicitate all the team members on behalf of my department. And once again, I congratulate you and I extend my sincere thanks to all of you for giving such a occasion for me. And okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you all for being here for a long time. I think 1.5 hours we have spent virtually in touch, even though we are physically away in different spaces and time zones. There are people watching YouTube from different countries, from different parts of India. They are messaging through WhatsApp and Facebook and YouTube. So I will request all of you to be tuned to the YouTube channel and attend the feedback questions, and you have to send back to the organizers, and you will be getting a good reward of not only the theoretical and food for thought, but also for your career as a participant in an international webinar. So I request all the participants to be tuned in for the next session. We'll start on 2:30. There will be a guest from Italy, Sabrina Lay, and she will be talking about the times how we in international arena we are dealing with this pandemic. She is very experienced in interfaith and intercultural dialogue. She's very fond of the Kerala and its culture and the literature. So I would like all the participants be live on YouTube, and our beloved guest to be attentive for this function. And on the behalf of the organizers, I thank Dr. Sunitha and dear colleagues for being with us in this morning. Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shall I log out then? Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.